is going to be given by Professor Willard Johnson out of MIT. The title is Black America and Black Africa, How Black Americans Can Improve U.S. Policy to the Black World. And we're lucky enough to have Jason Vickers from MIT introduce Professor Johnson. He's had a lot of dealings with him, so he's pretty qualified to do that. Here's Jason. Thanks.
Dr. Willard Johnson, political science professor from MIT, received his BA in International Relations from UCLA, his MA from Johns Hopkins in African Studies, and went on to receive his PhD in political science from here at Harvard. He's been an adjunct professor at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, visiting assistant professor at the Harvard Business School, and an associate professor at MIT until 1973. Currently, he's one of the few black tenured professors at MIT. Dr. Johnson is now director of the Business Management Program for Development at MIT. He's director of the communications component of the Center of African American Issues, national co-chair of Concerned African Scholars, chairman of the board of Transamerica Forum, and holds many other positions. I can speak from personal experience when I say that Dr. Johnson is very dedicated to the education of his students in all of his areas of expertise that range from international relations to ancient African history. So I present to you a distinguished scholar and my professor in my Third World Studies class next semester, Dr. Willard Johnson.
Thank you, Jason. That was one of the nicest introductions I've had. And for someone to say they're willing to go on for more, you know, that's terrific. It's really a pleasure for me to be here. And I congratulate you all on this conference. I wish I had been able myself to attend its earlier sessions, but as I was just saying to one of my long-standing colleagues, we've had to fight for every inch of ground we have gained, and we have to fight to hold on to it. And so problems of that sort, since we have so few black faculty at MIT, tenured or otherwise, preoccupations with issues of that sort have kept me from coming to any of these sessions, which I really regret. But I would like to say a few cryptic words in a number of areas about how we might influence foreign policy, without going into great detail about specific problem or issue areas, with the hopes that when we see more or less holistically the opportunities and the plight that we confront, that you will have your own observations and questions, and then we can come back and go into more specific detail about particular issues and strategies. I also want to say that I am certainly going to call upon my good friend Ambassador Walter Carrington to add to my comments. Ambassador Carrington should stand and so that you can see him. He is a graduate of the Harvard Law School and is currently a visiting lecturer at MIT, and we will have a lecture series that he's going to give that we will publicize with you with the hopes that you will come and hear him. A person of long-standing stature with respect to the black presence in the foreign policy field, and one of our few ex-black ambassadors. I want to talk within the frame of several dimensions of the requirements for us affecting foreign policy. The key buzzwords will be awareness, connectedness, organization, discipline, sense of priorities, and activism. And I'll come back to those. But let me start by saying that I think we're poised on an extremely important turning point with the change from the Reagan to the Bush administration. Because fundamentally what we have an opportunity for is a change in mindset. And mindsets matter tremendously. The frame of analysis that has predominated this country's orientation to the third world has been one of the principal problems we have confronted. There are lots of structural problems, lots of performance problems, lots of capacity problems that are also important, but fundamentally it has been the point of view that has guided and dominated the American official policymaking arena that has been the principal problem. Mindsets matter tremendously. They're affected by culture, to be sure. They're affected by circumstances. Sometimes it's very hard for people to understand even how things seen one way could be seen any other way. Let me tell you a story that connects Walter Carrington and I and a number of other people who might be in the room. Sometime back in what we thought was going to be the kind of heyday of our new era, in the Carter administration, we had the opportunity to be in the White House to receive the newly elected president of Zimbabwe. Tremendous sense of elan and ebullience and so forth, and Robert Mugabe was hosted by President Jimmy Carter. And Carter was, of course, confronting a very difficult I guess he didn't really realize then how difficult a campaign for re-election. And Mugabe had just pulled off one of the most astounding, seemingly upset victories one could imagine. So in this august setting, packed with activists from around the black world and a few of the whites who had joined that struggle, we had a demonstration on how mindsets and cultural context can matter with respect to how people understand things. Jimmy Carter said, you know, he was so impressed with Mugabe's victory, and he wondered if Mugabe could give him some pointers, you know, in his election campaign. And Mugabe, who is a very taciturn and dignified man, said, well, you know, we have always found that symbols matter a lot for us, and so in choosing our party symbol, we wanted something that would really tell the people we were confronting an opportunity for a new day. So we chose the crowing cock, and we won. He said, so I don't know if you want to change your party symbol, but in our eyes, you, Jimmy Carter, are the cock of America. And everybody in that room sort of chuckled, and one person said, you know, some things just don't translate across cultures. Carter didn't know what to do with this, but Ronald Reagan did. Ronald Reagan, in fact, if you'll recall, picked up on that, and in his inaugural said, it's morning time in America. That's really what Mugabe had in mind. You have an opportunity to confront a sense of a new day. Even we in the room didn't really catch how significant this opportunity was for us. It's a mindset. Reagan came in very effectively to articulate what a lot of people seized upon as a sense of a new era. Clearly, he represented the right wing of American politics, but somehow or another we were all inclined to call it the new right. But then when you looked at it, you found that the new right was fundamentally made up of old wrongs. Ones we were very familiar with, the old racism, not all that hidden, in fact. The jingoism, the sense that America was first and that the correct world order would recognize that, the chauvinism even, whether you consider it from gender or from national relationships, the sense that right meant white. And in all of the policy domains, domestic and international, you began to see that moving forward. He could talk about not doing business as usual with oppression with the greatest of earnestness and apply it only to Poland and not see its relevance to South Africa. And be attributed with the qualities of being the great communicator nonetheless. We had a change, for sure, from Carter to Reagan, but it was a retrogressive change. And we came to see that Carter was in many ways a prefiguration, a kind of anticipation of a new era, and that Reagan was a throwback. I'd like to hope that Reagan will wind up, in fact, being the last president of the 19th century. It was very much a 19th century kind of framework that we were dealing with, the notion that Central America is our backyard. You go in your backyard, and in fact, the whole of the third world is considered our backyard. You go in the backyard, you take what you want. So it's that sense that somehow or another the right ordering of the world was with the great powers and their relationships, their needs, fundamentally primordial and preeminent. And there wasn't much sense then that you had to negotiate. There was no sense that there was real power distributed out there throughout the third world. I think that was fundamentally wrong. It was a misperception of the actual realities of this age, that power is already distributed enough for us to resist, at home and abroad. But there can be tremendous damage to our prospects, immediate and long term, if these misperceptions of that reality continue. And that's what we have an opportunity, I think, to see change now. There is a chance for change with Bush. I'd like to call this, in fact, influencing foreign policy from the Bush. The Cold War is really over. It's not over because Bush has yet projected that realization. It is over because Gorbachev has. And it's not clear that Gorbachev has ended the Cold War because he wanted to. I think there's no question the Soviet system economically is a disastrous failure, and they really don't have much choice to. But it has changed a lot with respect to the prospects around the globe. And if the U.S. seizes upon or responds to, maybe seizes upon is itself a dangerous notion, but responds to that opportunity, we can see tremendous new opportunities for us. Let me just say very briefly what I think some of the structural aspects were of this misconnection between the previous mindset and the realities that represented the Cold War approach to the rest of the world was for sure a grid of understanding, an interpretive framework that put big power needs and relationships number one, but not even in security terms. Big power needs and relationships in perceptual terms. That is to say, we put ideology first. We did. Maybe the Soviet Union did the same, but it was fundamentally for us a sense that essentially the Soviets, as Reagan said, was the evil empire, were out to order the world in a very particular way, dangerous to the American system. And one would interpret everything they did and everything that anyone connected with them in any way did in that frame. So it was an assumption that there were no real actors in the third world. They were all puppets, teleguided some kind of way, extensions of the power of the Soviet Union, if they were not in our own hands. If they weren't our allies, our puppets, then they must be theirs. So, ironically, the U.S., I think, put ideology first, even above our security, and we often, in fact, wound up jeopardizing our real security because of that. But even our notions of security were security in the grand sense, security in the strategic sense. And it's not wrong, in fact, I think, for any government, any state, to put security first. I mean, fundamentally, survival is the important thing, and the big powers were the only ones who could determine the survival of everybody else. So yes, survival is the primordial commitment. It's the fundamental obligation of any government. It's the basis of government, security. But we had put ideology even above that. We had allowed our own understanding of the requisites of security, even in the grand sense, to be dangerously misconstrued. And the notion of petty security, that is to say, our understanding that every government is fundamentally concerned about its own survival and then, by extension, the survival of its own people and system, we didn't understand that at all. So that we could never see that people moving in the third world, whatever they may do, might be motivated not by some extension of Soviet intention and power, but by their own needs. And also, perhaps in keeping with American ideological orientations, but I think very much out of step with reality, we put economic questions last. With a very poor understanding of even how our own economic policy had been jeopardized, our own economic status had been jeopardized by ideological insecurity, falsely construed security situations. That mapped very poorly on the realities of the third world, where regime security, petty security, immediate local security was the number one issue. You're talking about weak states, states that nowhere can feel confident that they're in control of very much. If those states are going to be reacted to in everything they do as if they are, in fact, actors in some grand chess game, then you're going to find that their needs are going to be misinterpreted and misapplied, and it will exacerbate, not alleviate, problems of human rights, oppression, denial of democratic opportunity, and so forth. These regimes that are beleaguered just to be, even in their positive program, to the extent that they may be trying to promote and carry out development from a position of weakness. They're struggling with a need and an intention to penetrate their own societies and somehow or another make things happen, and then have to be concerned about the intrusion into their local situation of these imposed external grandiose big power Cold War considerations. So regime security, which was very low in our understanding, was number one for them. And not far behind, very closely related to it, would be the economic considerations. And number one for them now, and for a long time, has been the acquisition of capital. And now that means the problem of debt, the number one issue. I'll come back to that. Economic recovery rather than development. Virtually no third world country now can talk about development. It is talk about survival, getting back to where we were maybe 10 years ago. And that's very much dependent on what happens in the global economy. Virtually no state is in a position to determine that. Walter Rodney long ago said, you cannot understand what's going on in any third world country by looking inside the third world country. You have to see it in the global context. So that's particularly true given the economic circumstances of today. And last and least important to third world countries is ideology. And grand ideology, grandiose notions of choices between Marxism and capitalism and so on. There's virtually no third world country concerned about that at all. With one exception, Islamic fundamentalism is in fact a battleground ideologically, indigenously. But notions of open markets, mixed economies, foreign capital, and so forth and so on, they don't care, whatever works. And central planning, by and large, has been seen not to work because the capacities to control it, even to understand it perhaps, but certainly to control it, just aren't there. So if the U.S. was concerned about grandiose choices of system and orientation, free enterprise, mixed economies, an opportunity for private capital, even international capital, that was won long ago. It's totally won. There is no ideological contest in those terms going on. Certainly not in Africa, not in most of the third world. So with that mismatch of mindsets that we have come out of, hopefully we're coming out of, how we go about trying to influence foreign policy really does emerge as a challenge for us. And in some ways, other people, I think, attribute to the black world much greater potency than perhaps it has. For example, one of my colleagues at MIT, William Griffith, who is one of the acknowledged experts on foreign policy, principally concerned with East-West relations and so forth, says, well, now Black America has a virtual veto over American policy towards Africa. I said, oh, really? It's a tribute, if there's any one person that's a tribute to, is Randall Robinson, although we are very weak if that is only Randall Robinson. If we can't find a way somehow or another to hold on to organizationally. But there is a perception that somehow or another we really have accomplished something extraordinary, the first veto override in the Reagan administration on a foreign policy issue at that, attributed to the work of Trans-Africa. I wish it were true that we had a veto. But I'm awfully glad that some people think we do, and that's itself a resource. We need to make good on that, number one, awareness. Perhaps the most fundamental basis of awareness, of course, is education. So again, thank you for this conference, and hopefully you will actually read some things. a constant theme of mine. But this is a community that is awfully low on the scale of reading as a basis for awareness. So I think it has to constantly be stressed. We need specialists. We need specialists. We don't see them coming. I haven't reproduced myself. I'm awfully glad to see a few folks coming along, taking up the mission. And I'm not going to let Charles or Greg or Jason or any of the others off the hook in that regard. But, by that I really mean that most of you are headed into fields that will not help us continue this battle. We don't have the policy analysts coming along. We don't have the social scientists coming along. You're going into law. And you could come back out of law. I mean, Walter Carrington did. Others have. Randall Robinson did. But, a lot of you are going to stay in law. Tax law even, or something like that. We need people who can be the continuing source of our understanding of our plight and our prospects. And social science doesn't pay a lot. It just rewards. And economists, they're just not, we're going to have a gap in our own capacity in the black community to understand the policies and set the policies from the secondary positions. Even when we get elected officials, you heard from Bill Gray and so forth, tremendous, unprecedented power, really. In my estimation, perhaps the most powerful black in the country. But his ability to stay on top of all of that has got to be based upon having somebody who can come in with policy paper on almost any given economic, finance, budgetary, and by implication, the extension of that into any field. And he's not going to find it very easy to draw on the black community for those analysts. And in any case, wherever you wind up, you have to pay attention. That is to say, you've got a triple burden. You're not just the burden of the two personalities, black and American. You're going to have the need to look at both your own professional area and this broader political context, domestic and international. And because we found that, in fact, there's something you can do at almost any level. We have made foreign policy into an issue for cities. We did that, really. And now, the cities they came to it initially through divestment, but now almost every major city has its own trade department, sending out missions to find markets for the companies that might locate there, because that's their job base, their tax base. And they found they can't leave that to the Department of State or Department of Commerce. But it's a way in which we find we can gain power, because we're more powerful at the level of the city than we are at the level of the federal government. And if we are aware of the way in which those connections follow, we can do something about that. Connectiveness is itself also another, as I said, another key buzzword. By that, the most important point of connection is your vote. We've come a long way. Blacks are now, I think, outperforming whites, other things being equal, with respect to registration, with respect to turnout, certainly with respect to solidarity in our voting. But that is our strength. And the contest really is going to turn there. We had the head of the CIA in town 2 days ago, Judge William Webster. And that turned out to be a very important opportunity for me that I I didn't think it would be. William Webster is one of the few major personalities we know will be there in the Bush administration. A lot of the other positions aren't filled yet. We don't know who the actors are going to be. But one of the major actors we know, and he's beginning to talk. And one of the things that he said about an issue of great concern to me about South Africa, you know, both scared me and activated me, because he said the problem with South Africa is it's too politicized as an issue in this country. You know, people can't talk about this issue at all now in any open way because they're afraid somehow or another of political pressures. Well, isn't that a tribute to us? You're saying, in effect, my God, you guys have come in and made it impossible for us to do what we really want to do. That is, in fact, our protection. And it's acknowledged. But beyond the vote, we also need to have the specialists, you know, and the actors right within the government. I mean, we have so few people who are in the Foreign Service who wanted to go into government service in a Reagan administration, in a Bush administration. Even those who were in there weren't posted. So we went from, 18 black ambassadors, 16 or 18, I can't remember, something in that order, down to about 1 or 2 posted and maybe 4 or 5 in the service under Reagan. And, you know, Walter Carrington can probably paint it in even bleaker terms than that. Whole era is over in that regard, and we need to recreate our position there. And I've already said that connectedness means looking at every level, at the city, at the state. Of course, you know that we have had both divestment and selective purchase issues regarding South Africa be very successful in this city and in this state, in many ways setting the agenda for the rest of the country. To do that means that you have to be organized. And we have several organizations. We have at least one. All of you should be members of Trans-Africa. It only costs you $10. And I'll be happy to take your $10 today. And I will guarantee that you will get a follow-up and you will be on the roster and so forth. But we need that level of organization. Otherwise, you really do have, you know, a few people talking as if we've got troops. And the perceptions that we have a veto, the perceptions that we have so politicized, that we've been successful in all of that, will begin to erode as it becomes apparent that somehow or another the level of organization has fallen off. And every organization that you belong to can tie into that. It's not just Trans-Africa, but a connection between all the organizations. Disciplined. What do we mean by discipline? By that, I don't mean loyal. I mean, the black vote is the most disciplined vote in America, but often that is taken to be our weakness, not our strength. That is to say, we're taken for granted because one assumes it's going to go to the Democratic Party. So we've got to be at a point where we could, in fact, shift it to some other party. Not necessarily Republicans. Maybe, in fact, it's time to have our own party that is itself a balance of power party. But in any case, the point is that we have to be able to deliver a block without that block being pre-counted. Priorities become then the critical issue, and I will say just a little bit about that and try to draw to a close. We are weak, in fact, around the world. We're beleaguered and we're on the defensive. So we cannot talk about ideals. That is to say, we're not going to realize the ideal outcomes. We have to sort of limit the damage. And that reverses to some extent the real priorities from what we have been pursuing. South Africa is quite far down on the list. I'd say from my perspective, I think number one will be, in fact, to end the famine. Famine is a man-made occurrence. It is not a natural occurrence. It reflects the breakdown of society, the malperformance of government, the capriciousness of the powerful. And sort of an index of really our plight is that famine is sort of so dominant throughout Africa. It is not easy to correct. You don't correct famine by sending food relief. So really, the most difficult of all, because it sort of embodies the whole global connection of all of our power bases, but that Africa is in famine from one end to the other, and the most serious and sustained period of famine, perhaps in the history of mankind, is a kind of index of our plight, and we have to keep that in mind. Number one, on the economic side, we have to get to development, we have to get to growth, but we can't get anywhere at this level of debt. $210 billion for the African states, at least. I mean, we don't really know what the figures are. The service obligations, in fact, that is to say, not paying back principal. Service includes both principal repayment and interest repayment, but the states are not in a position to pay back. Nobody's paying back principal. They're not even able to pay back all of the interest obligations. But even that is taking, on the average, about somewhere between 35 and 40% of the export earnings of African states. So virtually half of every dollar they earn in participating in the global setting is lost to anything like development. And for some countries, in fact, it's much, much higher. I think it's time for African states to talk about repudiating the debt. Repudiating the debt. Even though that threatens a cutoff with most of the institutions of the global financial and trade marketplace. But it is impossible for Africa to anywhere by paying the debt. And maybe the threat of repudiation will cause a quiver and a shaking in the centers of power, and we'll get some sort of excuse of that, not just rescheduling. Rescheduling in some ways deepens the hole. As you know, if you've ever refinanced your car or your house, you just wind up, or your student loan, you wind up with more to pay, not less. It's just spread out so that any given month you're paying less. That's needed in order to get to recovery, and recovery, of course, comes before growth. We're not seeing growth virtually anywhere. Even though states dependent on minerals and on petroleum export are not in a position to grow. Those markets are devastated. Commodities at the lowest level in recorded history, vis-a-vis industrial prices. So I put those economic issues before the questions of the peace plan for Southern Africa, the Namibia implementation of a long-awaited, we could have had it 6 years ago if Chester Crocker really had been in favor of Namibian independence. He will get the credit now for one of the great successes of the Reagan administration, ironically. But implementing the peace plan, of course, has to be something we look at, but it is actually, I think, secondary to the economic questions. Constraining South African destabilization in the region, of course, that continues to be a problem. So we have to constantly press to undermine its strength and maybe even put up direct barriers, military and diplomatic. Helping the frontline states because they are the ones being destabilized. The cost they have paid in their infrastructure, in their the human cost is just staggering. Amputee capital of the world on both sides of South Africa, Angola and Mozambique, is just incredible. And yet the U.S., the Bush administration even, is still talking about funding UNITA and RENAMO, the two, I'd say, terrorist rebel groups in Angola and Mozambique, even though they can't talk so openly about continuing to fund the Contras. But you know, in fact, that the pressures from within that administration to do all three. And that has to be an issue for us. And helping the peasants directly, that is to say, seeing development as something that happens at the grassroots level. Again, ask Carrington to comment on that because he works with AfriCare, which is a black organization essentially doing that kind of work. We have to therefore be aware, connected, organized, disciplined, sense of priorities, and active in all of that. Active. It means contributing your money, your time, being a part of it, joining, voting, mobilizing, instructing, and doing it everywhere you are. One of the great things about the 1960s is that really was a revolutionary time. It's perhaps the most creative period in American history, maybe ever. Certainly it ranks with the era of the Civil War and Reconstruction and the era of independence itself, in as much as everywhere you went, everybody felt touched. And in the end, there was no community of any size at all, black people, where there wasn't something happening, where there wasn't initiative being taken. It's that level of mobilization and response and initiative and creativity that has to be unleashed here. And if we had that mindset ourselves about it, I'm sure, in fact, that our chance for change, our chance for challenge would be realized. So I welcome you all as new members of Trans-African, and I congratulate you for this splendid conference, because I'm sure in every arena and every subject matter that you've covered, somewhat of the same kind of issue has been posed. And the challenge for you, in fact, to be more than a student at this time. So thank you. I hope that you'll allow Ambassador Carrington to be a commentary and to add to my comments, and hopefully you will also have your own comments as well as questions to pose to both of us.
It is never an easy task to follow Willard Johnson to the podium because by the time you get there, he has said everything that you might want to say and done it with more depth than you would be able to bring to it. So I'll just make a few commentaries on some of the things he said to underscore and agree with much of what he said. When he talked about the mindset of this new administration and a mindset to foreign policy, it is very true that in the Reagan administration, as perhaps never before in our country, ideology, almost theology, took over, and pragmatism went by the boards. The administration had in mind something called the Reagan Doctrine, which required the rollback of communist gains wherever they were perceived to have taken place, the destabilizing of so-called Marxist governments, and all of this was to be done because, by definition, these governments were evil, and therefore the Reagan administration proceeded on a path which took very little into consideration whether or not what we were doing was actually going to be in furtherance of our major strategic goal in the world, which had to do with our confrontation with the Soviet Union, so that in many cases we ended up following the Reagan Doctrine, but also at the same time perhaps making the Soviet Union, if not stronger, certainly making the United States weaker in terms of its ability to influence events in the Third World. Now, there is hope with the Bush administration, mainly because Bush comes from an old pragmatist school of politics, which is far less interested in ideology. In fact, in many ways is embarrassed by ideology, and will be looking for practical results, and there, it seems to me, we have our opportunity. However, one cannot be over-optimistic, because the very first thing the Bush administration did in foreign policy, even before Bush took the oath of office, was to write a letter to Jonas Savimbi in care of a post office box in Washington, D.C., in which he told Savimbi, reassured him, that his administration would continue to support UNITA as the Reagan administration had done. Now, what is going to happen, it seems to me, very early on in this administration, is that the right-wing ideologues, those who are left, are going to be looking for victories. They are finding very few of them. In fact, they are beginning now to devour one another. If any of you watched the John Tower hearings, what a spectacle it was to see Paul Weyrich, who represents really the far-out lunatic fringe of the right, jumping on John Tower as somebody who is not right-wing enough. Now, that was the first time I had ever seen John Tower perceived as anywhere near even the center of the political spectrum. But they feared that John Tower would become a pragmatist, would not support SDI and some of the other, again, theological views of defense that the prior administration had. So they're going to be looking for victories. They are jumping on Dr. Lewis Sullivan on the abortion issue, and they want to get a victory there. They are worried that they won't have a victory in Latin America in terms of the Contras. And so they see the Savimbi and Angola as a very easy victory, because Angola is not something that very many people care about. Well, that very perception that Professor Johnson talked about, the perception that black America has a veto over foreign policy regarding Southern Africa, has got to be a perception that we reinvigorate. Because it seems to me that on Savimbi, we can have some influence. Because as long as the administration feels that there is no pressure from the center or the left on Savimbi, it will continue doing what it has done. When it feels that the cost is too great, then I think we can get it to moderate its views on Angola as it has moderated its views on the Contras. Professor Johnson talked about the so-called victory of Chester Crocker, and I don't want to go into that in any great detail, except to say that however you regard it, and I agree with him completely, that it is a false victory. It's sort of like the situation where a relief pitcher comes into a ball game in the ninth inning with nobody out. With 2 outs, nobody on base, and he proceeds to give up 9 or 10 runs, and finally gets the last man out and gets applause because he did retire the side, but at what cost? And that's precisely what's happened in Angola, because what we got now we could have had 9 years ago at the end of the Carter administration. And what has happened has been a tremendous loss of life and a loss of American ability to have greater leverage in Southern Africa because of the policies of this administration. However, the fact that it is perceived as a victory gives the Bush administration some room to make compromises on Angola. And we can push them to those compromises, to having them pull back from supporting Savimbi if it is framed that by further support to Savimbi you are likely to undercut the one foreign policy victory that they are talking about in Africa. So it seems to me it is very important that we continue to put pressure there, because I think we can get a victory in Angola on the question of support to the Savimbi regime, to the Savimbi insurgency. One of the other issues that it seems to me we're going to be facing in the next few years is the fallout of perestroika. Glasnost is fine, and openness in the Soviet Union is fine. However, I think that many Africans are beginning to worry about what perestroika is going to mean, because already we are seeing in the aftermath of the Namibia talks that the Soviet Union is likely to line up on a number of crucial issues more with the United States than with the Africans. You've got some very practical questions as to how you in fact begin to carry out the United Nations resolution on Namibia, how it is going to be financed, etc. And there is a fear that, in fact, the Soviet Union may find itself taking the same kind of position in the United Nations of caution and of fiscal responsibility, etc., in terms of what is done to ensure that the transition to independence in Namibia is a smooth one. And it is almost as if one is seeing a vision that one got back in the 1960s. Willard, I know, has been a long-time reader, as I have been, of Jeune Afrique. He may not remember the days when Jeune Afrique, back in the 60s, had a comic strip heroine called Serafina. Serafina was an Arab woman who was sort of the great protector of third world interests. And her nemesis was a agent, I've forgotten his name, but it was something like Ivanovich Jones, representing the SAR, which was the Soviet American Republic. And back in the 60s, there was the fear that the Soviet Union and the United States would come together. And in coming together, they would represent a danger to the third world, and that they would be opposed to third world interests. And we are, it seems to me, on the border of that right now with perestroika. And it will be interesting to see how that plays out, because it is going to be very important that neither Graham-Rudman nor any other excuses by this administration or by the Soviets be used as a way of reneging on the responsibilities that the United Nations assumed for supervising the process leading to complete independence in Namibia. When Dr. Johnson listed his priorities, I would agree with them that no question about it that the ending of famine in Africa has to be the #1 priority. It is beyond, it seems to me, the ending of famine. It is beginning to relook at the whole way in which aid to Africa has been formulated and has been carried out. It is really a question of ending the cycle of poverty on the African continent that we must deal with. But when one talks about famine, it seems to me one is also talking about a very political problem. That if one looks at the famines of the 1980s, that in spite of all of the drought and all of the problems, you only had severe famine where people were starving and dying by the millions in those countries which were riven by war. Ethiopia, Chad, the Sudan, Angola, Mozambique. These were the countries that suffered most, and these are the countries which today are continuing to suffer, because it is impossible to bring about a real recuperation while these countries are being destabilized in the ways in which they are by civil wars and by wars of destabilization. Aiding the frontline states is important, and I think the only place where I would have a slight difference with Professor Johnson would be on the question of Renamo. I would think that the one thing the Reagan administration did right, at least partially right, was that the one place in the world where it was able to resist the right-wing fanatics in terms of the Reagan Doctrine was in Mozambique. There, in fact, Mozambique, for many ways, if I were a partisan of the Reagan Doctrine, I would have wanted to roll back the Frelimo government much quicker than I would have wanted to roll back the MPLA government. But for some reason, the Reagan administration took a different tact on Mozambique, supported the Frelimo government, took a great deal of heat from the right in terms of Renamo. And I think that that can be a lesson for George Bush, that he may be able, if he is pushed enough by us, to take that same kind of heat in terms of pulling back from Savimbi. Because if Reagan could refuse to go along on supporting Renamo, it seems to me we can get George Bush to do the same thing when it comes to UNITA and Savimbi. One closing word. Willard Johnson was recruiting you all to join Trans-Africa, and in that I would strongly support him, because Trans-Africa, we must keep that perception alive, and every time somebody wants to audit and see if there really are troops out there, we want to be able to show that, in fact, we have a real and not just a shadow army, and to keep people like the head of the CIA